Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today I'd like to talk about debate. Now, if you've spent much time watching, well, if you've ever seen television news, if you're older than a certain age, you probably have seen at least a little bit of it, all over the place on YouTube and so on. You can find people, ostensibly speaking, debating each other. And a great deal of this very much seems to be somewhere on the spectrum between two people alternating as they give a monologue. Presidential debates are often like that, I've noticed too. To two people screaming at each other. Less so in the presidential debates. But you'll see various forms of this, and that sort of forms a continuum on which a lot of things that are, theoretically speaking, debate take place. And you might get the impression from this that debate is a complete waste of time, and in a lot of circumstances you would be correct. But there actually are some values to, there are some cases in which debate is valuable, and I want to just talk a little bit about those. So it'll be useful in seeing when debate is not so useful, and also give some ideas of other things you can do, and I'll get into that briefly a little bit later. So the first thing where debate is useful is, of course, for children. Children need practice. Children need practice in thinking. Children need practice in thinking quickly. Children need practice in quickly analyzing an argument. Children need practice too in, being kept honest, which is one thing that, like a high school debating society, for example, is actually fairly good at, because if you make a flabby argument, someone will point this out to you. And I don't think it takes a huge amount of practice, varies with the individual, to, start to be able to do that for yourself. After a while, you should be able to carry on both halves of the debate fairly well. And most people, I think, who get it all good at debate from like debating societies and so on, could do that fairly well. They could, go on the one side, go on the other, and just go back and forth and take both halves of the debate and do a decent job. Not, that's not the, purpose for which reasoning was invented, but it is, however, very useful. Especially, us being creatures who live in time, the faster you get at being able to understand what somebody's saying, see the strengths of it as well as the weaknesses, and be able to address that, the better off you are. It'll save you a lot of time. Getting used to being able to analyze things, structurally and see like what is the argument another person is making is a very, very useful skill, and debating will teach you to do that. In a decent debating society. I mean, obviously, if you're the only person there who's actually interested in things like logic, then it won't do you much good. But in a decent debating society with other people, it can be very useful. I think once you've learned that skill, it isn't really very interesting in the same way that, we don't do much of anything else. Adults don't do much of anything else done in high school outside of high school. For the simple reason that having already learned it, you don't need to keep doing that. Okay, the other place, and and this is where adult debate, I think, actually is, has some real value, is when you have two people who largely agree with each other. There you have a situation in which debate can actually be productive. Because when two people largely agree with each other, and this can be a variety of things, this can be two Catholics who are arguing on, some piece of Catholic theology or, frankly, natural philosophy or any number of other things. But it can be two people who agree on, say, two people who agree on the basics of economics. Two people who agree on, things like, proper football strategy. Whichever football you want, by the way, American or, the rest of the world's football, which America calls soccer. Anything like this, where you and somebody else substantially agree, the reason why debate can be very useful is because there is a wealth of knowledge the two of you both have and the two of you agree upon, such that you can draw on it and the other person will recognize that as true. And so with this sort of, large foundation that you have, one person can draw out connections between things that the other person did not see or did not consider, and these connections actually are useful information to the other person. And so in doing, point and counterpoint and seeing, but the problem with what you've just said is this other thing that you didn't actually connect in, or on the flip side, if you're in a particularly generous debate, which are the best kind of debates, incidentally, the ones where actually, your point is even stronger than you're claiming because of this thing. And no, it may not be correct, but again, in a generous debate, you can bolster someone's point before you then explain why it's actually wrong. If you're doing anything where things are, where you're trying to persuade an audience, then this becomes actually especially persuasive, because if you not only see the faults in what somebody's saying, but you also see what's correct about what somebody's saying, it's vastly more persuasive to anybody who's looking. It's also simply generous, which is good, and it helps everybody, which is also good. So it's always nice when incentives align with correct behavior. So that's a situation in which debate can actually be very useful. Debate can be edifying, where two people, as they keep pushing against each other, draw out connections the other one didn't see, and both learn from the drawing out of these connections. If I am debating somebody else who substantially agrees with me, let's say I was debating deflating atheism about the burden of proof. Because he has a slightly different, or a little bit of a different, at least a little bit of a different, not a wildly different opinion on it than I do, but he does. And so if he makes some point that I hadn't considered, I'm better off for knowing about this and seeing these connections. So it benefits the both of us to draw out connections the other didn't see. That, I think, is really the ideal for debating when you're not talking about being a child. It's not precisely the same as the idea of iron sharpens iron, but it's related to that idea, that you really can derive real benefit from this, and it's closely related to what you see in a lot of university settings, called the Socratic method. But the Socratic method is essentially two people who largely agree with each other arguing about things, and debate and argument aren't very different unless you're being highly formal about it. So that's where, and the formality of a debate, by the way, can be useful, especially if you have an audience, because there's something about the adrenaline involved and so on of having an audience and you're debating people where other people are watching, that sort of makes people at their sharpest, makes them at their quickest, most likely to actually think of things, at least for many people. So there's some real value in that. In the same way, if you're practicing any skill, one of the things I do, although I haven't got a chance lately, is swing dance, Lindy Hop specifically. And there's a lot to be said for dancing in front of other people, as much as practicing in a private setting where you don't have to worry about what other people think is itself very valuable. There's a lot to be said for dancing in front of other people too, because it just forces you to try your hardest in a way that being fallen creatures very little else will. So that, I think, is the primary use of debate. And then just relatedly, in some cases when you get into things that are like debates, but you have no premises, there's no real shared base of knowledge. There's no premises you have in common with somebody. And so the upshot is that all you can do is go back and forth highlighting the fact that we don't share the same premises. So, if somebody's saying that, say you come from the classical tradition, where you believe that people being different, what is important is justice, and therefore that people are able to proceed according to their natural talents and their circumstances, without unjust impedance, and to do as well as they can given their starting point. And somebody else comes from the premise of everybody should have an equal outcome, and anything besides an equal outcome is evil. You can highlight this fact. You can say, like, well, yeah, such and such does produce an unequal outcome, but that's correct. And another person says, no, it produces an unequal outcome, therefore it's incorrect. And then you've got nothing else to say because you've got two fundamentally different metrics upon which you do not agree. So you can go back and forth saying, I don't agree with your metric, I use mine. But at that point, you can go back and try to debate these metrics. If you do, it ceases to become a debate on whatever topic you had been talking about before, and now becomes a debate about fundamentals. And the thing about debates about fundamentals is, by and large, they never go anywhere. Fundamental things tend to be, fundamental. And so they're not they're the outcome, fundamental things in general are the outcome of many, many years of lived experience, of things that people have a hard time describing in words, but have been learning from over, if you look, there are 3,600 seconds in an hour, and you're awake for, anywhere between about 12 and 20 hours a day, depending on the day and the person. That makes for an awful lot of experiences. That's a tremendous amount of data accumulated as you've been living your life. And all of these things tend to point to something, even if you can't articulate it. And that's the thing upon which fundamentals very often are based. Not, and very few people ever come to some fundamental as the result of like a 5-step argument you can put in words. And by very rarely, I mean, I've never heard of such a thing, and I've never heard of anyone who's heard of such a thing. So debates about fundamentals usually have no purpose or value. And debates about things where you don't, share fundamental stuff with people, if you understand each other, they just quickly resolve into saying, yeah, we don't agree on this fundamental thing, and you're done. The one thing that can be useful in circumstances like this to do, and this is just sort of a life tip for those who don't have much experience of talking with people, is you will find a lot of people who make the fundamental assumption that anything different from me is evil. Not explicitly, not as such, but it is incredibly natural to people to assume that difference is defect. And so if you don't agree with, if you're not like me, then you must be bad, is a very common human reaction. You see this all over the place in modern political discourse within America, and probably within other countries too, since it's a fundamental human thing. Different expression in different circumstances, of course, but really common. So the one thing that can be very useful here to do is not to argue the fundamentals, but rather to show somebody how the difference in fundamentals, given these same goals of wanting everybody to be happy, because everybody has, in some vague sense at least, the general goal that all human beings should be as happy as possible, given reality as it is. And so people will, however, when they see, well, you don't come to the same conclusions as me, so you probably have different goals than me, which is, it works in small things. Like if you see a person who is peeling an orange differently, they may well have a different, peeling a banana differently or something. They may well have a different goal than you. They may not be trying to accomplish the same thing. But on the other hand, in bigger stuff, people will generalize this, and it doesn't work so well. And so here, it can be very valuable to explain to people, look, I want everyone to be happy as reality, as it is, will actually permit them to be. And given this fundamental disagreement we have, I come to a different conclusion about what will actually work. And of course, I think that what you are doing will actually cause misery and sadness. And the thing that I am doing will cause general happiness. I know you disagree and think the opposite. That's the result of us having, different beliefs about the world. But we're both trying to accomplish good things for everybody. We both have those sorts of goals. So, especially the younger or the less experienced the person you're talking to, the more valuable it can be to point that out. Older, more experienced people will tend to know that disagreements and premises lead to things like different approaches and so on, but to the same sort of goals of, human happiness. But of course, if this is even relevant to you, it's probably because you're not talking with the sort of person who already understands that sort of thing. Okay, so that's the one thing. If you're in one of those sort of degenerate debates, what can be useful is turning it away from a debate into seeing how a disagreement does not make anybody a monster. It is simply a disagreement, and there's no particular way of settling this other than coming to a better coming to some sort of mutual understanding. One person changing their mind rather on fundamental premises. Okay, so hope you found this interesting or helpful or something, and until next time, may you hit everything you aim at. Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today I'd like to talk about debate. Now, if you've spent much time watching, well, if you've ever seen television news, if you're older than a certain age, you probably have seen at least a little bit of it, or all over the place on YouTube and so on. You can find people, ostensibly speaking, debating each other. And a great deal of this very much seems to be somewhere on the spectrum between two people alternating as they give a monologue. Presidential debates are often like that, I've noticed too. To two people screaming at each other. Less so in the presidential debates. But you'll see various forms of this, and that sort of forms a continuum on which a lot of things that are, theoretically speaking, debate take place. And you might get the impression from this that debate is a complete waste of time, and in a lot of circumstances, you would be correct. But there actually are some values to, there are some cases in which debate is valuable, and I want to just talk a little bit about those. So it'll be useful in seeing when debate is not so useful, and also give some ideas of other things you can do, and I'll get into that briefly a little bit later. So the first thing where debate is useful is